I'm really looking forward to this program. I've got my crash helmet on, metaphorically. Let me remind everybody that, at least I believe, it's the duty of this club to lean into our elections as opposed to shy away from it. And Rotary is that sanctuary where reasonable people can agree to disagree as we educate ourselves on the policy issues and not the partisan politics of the moment. And so thank you, like Dennis did, for running to the raw with me today. For those of you who don't know Eric is the global chair of public policy and regulation at Dentons, the world's largest law firm. He also leads the firm's US public policy practice, leveraging his 3 decades of experience at the very highest levels of the federal and state governments. Eric is a renowned lecturer and political counselor who's widely regarded as one of the nation's preeminent public policy thought leaders, and he has served in the administrations of 3 US presidents and as a senior advisor to US Senator Paul Coverdell and Governor Sonny Perdue, as well as holding a US Senate confirmable post governing a federal agency. He has been involved in dozens of political campaigns at the federal, state, and local level, including 6 presidential campaigns, which makes him the perfect moderator for today's program. Eric, we look forward to your steady hand and for you to welcome our 2 panelists, Theron and Brian, to the stage. So welcome.
Brian and Theron, thank you for being with us. For those that may not know Brian and Theron, I'll just briefly tell you a little bit about their backgrounds. Starting with Theron. Theron Johnson is the founder and CEO of Paramount Consulting Group, which is a government affairs and communications firm. He's a longtime advisor and counselor to numerous elected officials and campaigns at the federal, state, and local level, including the Biden-Harris campaign, President Barack Obama, Congressman John Lewis, DeKalb CEO Michael Thurmond, Atlanta Mayors Keisha Lance Bottom and Kasim Reed, and Congressman John Barrow. Brian Robinson owns Robinson Republic, a communications consulting firm. He has also been very active in government and politics. He was a longtime advisor to elected officials, including Governor Nathan Deal, where he served as his deputy chief of staff and campaign communications director, Congressman Lynn Westmoreland, and numerous other state and local officials. Both Theron and Brian co-host WABE's popular Political Breakfast podcast, which is ranked among the top 40 podcasts nationally. And they both serve as panelists on Fox 5 Atlanta Georgia Gang, and each write a column for Georgia Trend magazine. So I cannot think of 2 better people to join us today for a discussion about the election. So let's begin with some level setting here. So we are in the midst of a historic election. We have a former president who lost his re-election but is running again. He won his primary against a number of highly qualified opponents, including his own vice president. He's an indicted felon. We also have an incumbent president who stepped down after securing his party's nomination, and his vice president became the nominee without having to win a primary. The former president survived not 1, but 2 assassination attempts. We've seen historic fundraising. I think the Harris campaign has raised over $1 billion, not counting super PACs. We've only had 1 presidential debate among the 2 candidates. We've seen historic early voting, and the latest New York Times Siena national poll has the race tied at 48-48, dead even. So, how are you both feeling about the presidential election 1 year out? And Theron, let's start with you.
Well, I was feeling real good when you started here. First of all, thank you, President Adrian and Eric, for inviting us and moderating this discussion. I was reminded earlier, Eric and I, you guys may remember, we were here 2 years ago, and we had this sort of boxing theme. I came up with my gloves, and Eric came up with his gloves. But because this election is so tribal right now and so intense, we decided to not do the boxing gloves. Look, I just got back from a weekend in Milwaukee and Chicago. And the reason I chose to go to Milwaukee is because Wisconsin is a battleground state. And so my wife was very kind to let me go and do something that I love doing. And Eric, you've worked on a bunch of presidential campaigns. I know you've worked on campaigns as well on the national level, Brian. So it's nothing like knocking on those doors. And I'm going to be brief because I know we got a lot of questions to get to. But I feel good because it's an everyday thing. You know, you got to look at the polling. It gives you sort of a snapshot on where the electorate is. But just by a show of hands, let's get this Rotarian crowd engaged. All right, don't worry. I'm not going to ask you all a question that you don't want to.
Who are you voting for?
Yeah. Yeah. But raise your hand, seriously, if you voted already.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow.
So, thank you. So real quick, we're not here to persuade you, right? You've already voted for who you're going to vote for. And what you guys should be proud of is not just as Rotarians and visitors and visiting Rotarians, but as Georgians, is that we're leading the country when it comes to this type of early voting. Right now, as we sit here, there are 2.8 million people who voted. Now, real quick, B-Rob has heard me say now for almost 10 years, the demographic shifts are going our way in Georgia, and when more people vote, we win. And that happened in 2020. What has happened now is that Republicans have actually taken a playbook out of our, play out of our playbook by getting more white Republicans, 50 or older, to vote early, where historically they voted absentee or day of. So Eric, I feel real good about our chances. I think the numbers are going in our way. The Latino vote, the African American vote, and the Asian vote are all a part of this winning coalition. Of course, we got to do better with white men, but it's the vote of the women. You look at it, 55% of the people who voted already are women. And I think that the Harris-Walz campaign has done an extraordinary job of trying to appeal to that very strong base of voters. And so I feel real good now. We got the money. The fundamentals are in play. I just don't really know how the next 2 days are going to go. But as long as people continue to vote at this level, with this level of intensity, I think that Kamala Harris can win Georgia.
Brian, how do you feel?
Well, first let me thank Theron, because he has not missed an opportunity until just now to make fun of me for saying Georgia would have low turnout this year.
It's Rotary. I wanted to be nice.
Yeah.
And we got Jennifer here, but Jennifer heard on the podcast.
That's right.
On our podcast.
Yeah, you passed the 4-way test, buddy. Thank you. Yeah, try it on the show. I want to say thank you to President Adrian and Eric for having us as well. Some of you may remember I was here as your speaker 8 years ago this week. So now we know it takes 8 years to forget. Now I'm back. So how do we feel going into it? Well, I was wrong about the enthusiasm. We saw in the early part of the year the double haters really driving the public opinion. You hear focus groups and you hear the lesser of two evils. I just didn't think people were going to be excited to go vote for these options. And if you're in Georgia, once you kind of get below that presidential line, there's not a lot there, just some confusing ballot questions that no one seems to understand. So, but I was wrong. And where I was right, though, was we are an outlier. And Georgia's early vote has been off the charts, despite all of these voter suppression efforts that have been put into place. That's a joke. Right. But you're not seeing the early vote like you are in Georgia and other parts of the country. So that's where I was right, kind of on that energy. So in Georgia, I think right now, and this actually surprises me, I would not have guessed this 6 months ago. 2 years ago, when you saw Brian Kemp and Raffensperger and Carr win primaries against Trump-picked candidates, I really thought there was this really strong anti-Trump feeling within the state. And he's overcome that to some degree. The party, the Republicans are very unified here. And a lot of the old Republicans, the people who voted for the people you used to work for and that I used to work for, Coverdale and Deal, a lot of those are just Democrats now. It's sort of baked in. They've switched over. I think Trump is on a pathway to winning Georgia, and here's why. That 48-48, that's a national number. Democrats need to be up 3, 4, maybe 5% in national polls in order to win. Hillary Clinton went into the 2016 election with a lead. Everyone thought going into election night, including Theron, who was at her party, thought they were going to a victory party. Didn't go well. Yes. And so In Georgia, we're seeing slight leads for Trump consistently. You know, the numbers change from here to here a little bit, but it's a consistent lead. There's a pattern. That's what we have to look for here. If you look at the early vote electorate, Democrats really want to get a front-loaded lead in early voting. When Obama was on the ticket, those first weeks, you would see like 40-something% of the electorate was black. Right now, it's 26% black, 59% white. Now, Theron will tell you not all of those white voters are Republicans. That's certainly very true. But these numbers skew older and whiter than our population at large. 51.7%, that is the number of white registered voters in Georgia. So at 59%, white voters are far exceeding what their numbers are in the population. All of these things point toward a good chance for Trump to win here. The Trump campaign over the weekend said, from Brandon Phillips, who's one of the state directors, they feel like they have an 80,000 vote lead right now. That's not a science, that is an art. Don't take it to the bank, but I do think they're seeing something happen. So I can't speak to the entire country. I don't know what's going to happen in the suburbs of Philadelphia, but Trump is going to put together a coalition that's going to win Georgia.
All right, so voters overwhelmingly say the country's heading in the wrong direction. And the main issues that have been identified in polling are the economy, inflation, immigration, abortion, democracy. So, Brian, let's start with you. Comment on what you believe are the top issues for voters, or put another way, what are we going to learn from the exit polls next week as to what were the key issues that move voters?
They've been loud and clear. It's the cost of living and immigration. And voters who feel squeezed, even though we're at 4% unemployment, even though the stock market is at record highs, even though the macroeconomic data shows a really strong economy, a lot of regular Americans are not feeling that. They have jobs. In fact, they may have 3 jobs, and that's part of the issue, right? So as long as people are feeling squeezed, that's going to be bad for the incumbent party. They blame Kamala Harris for it. They blame Joe Biden for it. And what Trump benefits from is this feeling of nostalgia that everything was great in 2019 pre-COVID. So the second is immigration, and the crisis at the border is something that the Biden-Harris administration has to own. Numbers are down really low right now, and Kamala Harris is out there talking about it. But she can't answer the question, okay, well, if what you're doing now is working, why weren't you doing it 3 years ago? And that sort of chaos that we've seen is going to really hurt them. If Trump wins nationally, it's because of those 2 issues.
I'll try to be brief. I think it's definitely the economy, but you're seeing the Harris-Walz campaign start to tell a better story about the economy. My friend just talked about how the stock market is doing well. I may not, may just remind this group, right? Raphael Bostic, if he was here, I don't think I see him, but we were being warned by a lot of pundits that we were heading towards a national recession. And so if you look at how we have bounced back with a very low unemployment rate amongst African Americans and women, a spike in small businesses doing very well in this country, while inflation has actually been lowered, it's stabilized, it's not as high as it was just a month ago. Gas prices are going down, still too high. I can go on and on about how the Harris-Walz campaign is talking about this. But the other issue that I think is very important, Eric, is women's reproductive rights. If you look at this number of women who are voting, and I'm not going to assume that every woman experiences the same thing when it comes to freedom, particularly freedom what they can do with their body, but I guarantee you they think about their sisters, they think about their cousins, they think about their daughters, their granddaughters. And so a lot of women are going to the polls in massive numbers, not only voting for themselves, but they're voting for their children. And I think that I can sit here very confidently and tell you that the Trump-Vance campaign has not done as good of a job talking about this issue as the Harris-Walz campaign. The last thing I would say is this. We just had a mass shooting not far from here. I think there are a lot of parents, a lot of family members who are very concerned about responsible gun ownership in this country, how we can be gun owners, enforce your Second Amendment, but be responsible gun owners, deal with the issue around mental illness, deal with the issue of protecting our teachers. We have folks here from KIPP today. We want to make sure that these teachers can teach and these children can go home to their parents when they enter these schools, churches, and places like that. And then lastly, look, I believe that there are a lot of disaffected Republicans, some of whom are in this room, who are going to the polls, but they just can't find themselves to vote for Donald Trump. Some of them are Nikki Haley supporters. Some of them are old school Reagan Republicans who feel like the party that they once served and gave money to and knocked on doors, that party has abandoned them. And so I think that a lot of voters are really going to vote for two things. What's the future going to look like, and who's going to be able to bring us stability and reliability? And I just think that Kamala Harris, no matter what you say about her, she's been there. I'm happy to hear that Brian has acknowledged, one of the first Republicans to acknowledge publicly that the crisis, and it's a crisis, at the border is getting better. We can do both. We can stop illegals from coming in, but when they come here, give them a pathway to citizenship. So it doesn't have to be an or, it's an and. Secure the borders, but people who are here, like our dreamers who were born here, don't just do a mass deportation. Give them an opportunity to a right to citizenship. And I think that you're starting to see the American people kind of understand that that's where we got to go, because we are a country of migrants. You just saw Chloe and Bob and all these folks go to these other countries. And what they talked about is that they're just like us. We all want the same thing. We just want access to a quality life for our families, for our children, and to be able to have that. And I think that that's where, you know, the Harris Walls campaign has really got to continue to be proud to admit that it is a crisis, but we got to make sure that we work together to do something about it. And the reason, I think the answer to that question is, B-Rob, she would tell you the Republicans have been pushing back on any measure that the president and the Democrats have tried to push forward when it came to border security. Donald Trump himself called to say, don't vote for this bill because you'll give my then opponent the upper hand.
I'm trying not to let this get too political, but you may be going that direction there, Theron. Well, let me ask you this, Theron. The gender gap in this race is mind-blowing. Vice President Harris is dominating women. Former President Trump is leading with men. I'd like for you to comment on that, but also talk about black men, because that seems to be something where there are more black men, at least what's the Trump campaign is saying, are gravitating towards them than have in the past.
Well, you know, when I first got this invitation, I was like, wow, this is going to be 2-on-1, you know, Republican, Democrat. But I knew I was going to have to answer that question. And I'm going to answer it very honestly. I see a lot of my black male friends in the audience. And, you know, when I talked to Curly about this information, I really have taken the time, Eric, to go to barbershops, to play golf, to talk to the teachers, to talk to people, and say, hey, what do you really think about this election? And Pastor, what they come back to me is that they care about the same thing that every other demographic group care about. They care about public safety. They care about their economics. They want their children to get a good education. They want to be able to ride MARTA and be able to get places when they get the micromobility and different things. I mean, so all the issues are the same. But here's where the challenge lies. There's always been a small minority group of African American men who are conservative. I have people in my family who would say they were Republicans. It's the difference between being a conservative and a Republican and being a Trump supporter. So I call it a false flag, Eric. I don't think that there's these black men in Georgia that are running to vote for Trump. Now, there are some. I don't get a lot of them. They don't come up to me and tell me they're voting for Trump because they know where I stand. But I think what is happening is that the Republicans have done a better job this time around of actually at least paying attention to them, whether it's, you know, going to barbershops and throwing money at things. But I think that the demographic of voters with black men, look, we see our grandmothers, our mothers, our sisters, our cousins, like we uplift black women. And I think that to call out the second largest voting group in the Democratic Party, which are black men, was a very strategic way of Barack Obama saying, hey, we need you on this election. He got a lot of criticism. So I don't know who these black men are who are like adamantly out here supporting Trump. They exist apparently when you ask them a polling question. But I think that what I've been very proud of is that Kamala Harris put out a 5-point plan that directly impact black men. It's centered around education, how we need more teachers, give them training, cryptocurrency, loans to help them with entrepreneurship, to deal with health disparities amongst black men, particularly prostate cancer. I mean, these are 4 to 5 things that she's put forth. And so Trump definitely gets away with a lot of stuff as far as supporting them, but I think we'll be good. And as far as the gender gap, look, you got a woman and a man running. The women are supporting a woman. The men are supporting a male, but I think that we're going to be pleasantly surprised that a lot of those women are going to vote not just because she's a female, but vote because I think she represents their interests. what's going to be interesting to me is how many women actually vote for Trump. And I think that right now, with the high turnout amongst women, I think that's got to be a concern for them. But, you know, Eric, we'll be having this conversation about black men and the economy. You know, my good friend Ryan Wilson and I, we're doing our part to go have very uncomfortable conversations with black men. But I just think this whole notion that they're running to Trump is just really a false flag.
So I love this topic because it gets Theron all riled up when I talk about black men, you know.
He's an expert at it. Watch him. He's a good tell.
Yeah.
We've never seen him at the gathering spot, R-Dub, but he's about to tell you though.
Yeah. I'll be here for all your questions about black men later. Just come out, and I'll be here for a couple hours. We're seeing consistently in polling Trump getting 25% amongst black men in Georgia. One thing that's been happening overall is if you look at the Democratic coalition, as we've had this realignment, the fact that black voters are now the most conservative elements of the Democratic coalition is becoming more and more evident. And as Republicans have learned their lesson in a diversifying country, that, you know, Georgia's now overall, not our electorate, but overall a majority minority state. Republicans have figured out they've got to get some non-white votes if they're going to stay in power. And you are seeing it in how they're spending money this year. This Charlemagne the God commercial, I didn't know this who it was, right? I had to be told that's who that was. But
see what I'm talking about? See.
Yeah. But I learned it, right?
And I just I'm a student. And today I taught you who Bankroll Fresh was. With
that's
Kirk
true.
What Kirk Cousins says, walk in your trap, take over your trap. Like,
that's right.
I taught you that.
Political breakfast is always a cultural education. For me and everyone else. But you've got these two black guys who are very prominent podcasters, right? And they're talking about, you know, Kamala Harris wants to use our tax dollars to pay for transgender surgeries for prisoners. I don't like that. You know, how many in your lifetime, how often have you seen two black men featured in Republican ads a week out from an election? And not just a week out, that thing's been airing nonstop for weeks. You can't watch a football game without seeing it 7 times. So if the what Theron is saying about the false flag is like, look, is Trump going to win black voters? No, he's going to get crushed by black voters. The question is Kamala Harris going to get 90%? And the answer is no. And anything you get below 90% becomes very dangerous territory for Democrats in Georgia. This has changed somewhat as we've diversified, but there's this old 30-30 rule in Georgia. Democrats can win if at least 30% of the electorate is black and 30% of white voters vote Democrat. They had the first, they've rarely gotten the latter over the last generation. Exceptions include John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock. They probably got that 30% mark with white voters. That's why they now have an SEN in front of their names. So that is sort of the key for Democrats. And if Republicans are able to chop away, if getting that 30% of the black vote in the overall electorate doesn't mean what it used to mean for Democrats, that is the pathway for Republicans being able to maintain control in the state of Georgia. Now, one thing you're going to need to see in the coming years is not just black voters. You're going to need to start seeing some black candidates who get elected to office as Republicans in Georgia. I want to see more and more black members of the General Assembly who are Republican. That's the only way that Republicans have a chance of being in power in the 2030s.
All right, so I got a bunch more questions, and we're going to open it up soon. So this will be a little speed round. On the battleground states, I know that you think Georgia will go for Harris, and Brian, you think Georgia will go for...
I don't think he really believes that.
Well, that's what he said.
I don't think he really believes that.
All right, so just real quick, let's just go through these. Who do you think is going to win Michigan?
I think Kamala Harris wins Michigan.
Brian?
I think Trump wins Michigan but loses Wisconsin.
Okay, where do you think about Wisconsin, Theron?
We win Wisconsin. I was just there.
All right, North Carolina.
Trump. But it's tight. It's
tight. 2012, you know this, right?
Yeah.
I was over the South. I got to say North Carolina, but it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough.
All right, Arizona.
Trump.
Harris by a slim margin. Slim.
Nevada.
I think Nevada is going to be the election night surprise.
Oh, okay.
Oh, really? Everything I've seen is Democrats kind of spending less in Nevada in Arizona, which makes me think Trump's going to win both.
All right, so now I left the big one to the end, Pennsylvania.
I look at a few of my friends in here. Look, let me just say, everybody thinks that had Kamala Harris picked Josh Shapiro, we would be in this tight race in Pennsylvania. I agree with that. However, I think that Governor Shapiro is working hard. He's pulling together that coalition. She's going to win Pennsylvania because the suburbs, these disaffected working class, blue collar Pennsylvania workers, honestly, who I think went for Trump in 2016, come back to her. I think Walz does help her. Shapiro would have been better, Norm. I agree. But I think that she barely wins Pennsylvania. And it won't be decided on election night. I think we'll go into like 3 or 4 days with Pennsylvania.
That part is no doubt true. You're absolutely right. They have a Byzantine vote counting process. And Pennsylvania, let's hope they're the focus of this, not us this time. But I think if she does lose Pennsylvania, and North Carolina, tight as a tick, really hard to say. It's a fool's errand to guess. But if Trump wins Pennsylvania, unfairly or fairly, Tim Walz will be seen as the worst ever and most consequentially bad VP pick in American history.
I can say the same thing about Vance.
All right, I got more questions.
Yeah.
So
Trump's going to win Ohio.
All right, so let's talk about the race for the majorities in Congress. So in the Senate, some will say that the Republicans will likely take over the Senate because of Manchin's retirement and Governor Justice likely winning that Senate race. And then in Montana, where President Trump is way up and Tim Sheehy's way up in that Senate race. However, in the last week or two, you've now seen Nebraska come into play where Deb Fischer, the incumbent Republican, is having a battle an independent who's creeping up. And then I saw a poll yesterday in Texas where Ted Cruz is only up 1 point. And then you have Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Ohio where there are incumbent Democrats that are in tight races, and then the open seat in Michigan. So what do you think is going to happen in the Senate?
I think we barely hold on to the Senate because of places like Texas and those other places. I mean, I said barely hold on. I mean, it's tight. And I think that I look forward to the day where I can say Speaker Hakeem Jeffries. I think we win the House.
That's good. That's fair. That's fair.
I did my homework.
But Republicans aren't going to win the Senate. I think that's pretty much a done deal. The one that I'm really fascinated by is the Ohio race. We are so tribal. Ohio is much more red than Georgia is now. It used to be one of the swing states. We've now switched spots. But Sherrod Brown I was a House staffer when he was on the House. I knew all his staff when he ran for Senate in 2006. And he has his own brand in Ohio in a way that few do. And if he wins, it's because of that. But it's if Trump wins by 8, 9 points, that's a lot of people who got to be Trump Brown voters. I would not want to be in his shoes and depending on that to happen. So Republicans win the Senate, almost a sure thing. And I think the House will be determined by whoever wins the presidency. I do think there will be some, what do you call it, on your coattails. I was reaching back here, coattails. The coattails will bring in to the majority whoever wins the presidency.
Even though that some of the battleground House seats are in New York and California, which really is not a competitive presidential, okay. All right, let's switch back to Georgia.
Because Trump would do okay in upstate New York, right? He'll do okay in the inland parts of California.
Yeah. Back in Georgia, the only other races are just some legislative races. So do you have any thoughts on the legislative races in Georgia? Are Republicans going to pick up any? Are they going to lose any? What do you think, Brian?
Both. Right now it's 102 to 78, Republican to Democrat. And here are the things that Theron and I are both looking at. We just did a big talk on this actually this morning on Political Breakfast when we taped. Obviously, a lot of you live in the Deborah Silcox district, I would imagine. That's one of the most expensive races in the history of Georgia, probably the most expensive for a state House race, which makes sense. It's also one of the wealthiest House districts in the entire country. That's a 50-50 race. And again, I do think the coattails could play a difference in who wins that. One that nobody's talking about in Metro Atlanta is a middle Georgia seat. It's an open seat, and the Democrats should have had this in their pocket, and all of a sudden it's super competitive. Noah Harbuck is the Republican, Tangi Herring is the Democrat. Keep an eye on that on election night. And as far as losses, look, Misha Maynor, who's a black Republican who switched parties during this last session, that district's a 90% Biden district. I mean, that's pretty hard to overcome. But take a look in Gwinnett County. There are 2 Democrat-held seats there, Farouk Mughal and Jasmine Clark, who are in seats that Kemp won in 22 with all of them on the same ballot. Republicans have put a lot of money into those 2 districts, so if they get pickups, that's where it'll be.
I'll be real quick. I agree with everything he said, except I think Tangi Herring wins that race in Middle Georgia. We'll protect our seats in Gwinnett. It's a fight. The Deborah Silcox-Susie Greenberg race is definitely one to watch, and I think we'll come out with a sort of like a net 2 gain from the election. All
right, I have one last question,
if
that's okay, because I don't want to, I mean, we've got these 2 talented people here. So let's look ahead to 2026, and what does this race mean here in Georgia for 2026? We have an open governor's race. We have Senator Ossoff up for re-election, congressional races, all of our state constitutional officers. So who wants to go first?
I'll take it. Look, we got to make sure that Jon Ossoff gets reelected in 2026. I think it's very important of who his running mate would be for governor. We need to have someone that is more like Raphael Warnock, who can actually go to the middle in November. And I think that we'll have a great group of candidates to fill every single seat in 2026. I'm not sure what Governor Kemp is going to do. Brian can answer that. But I definitely think that the senator is going to put together a good ticket. And whether Kamala Harris wins or losing, and I believe she's going to win, we'll basically be able to capitalize on that momentum going in 26.
My November Georgia Trend column, note all the product placement I'm doing during this, is about...
No placements on the road.
is about why Brian Kemp won't run for U.S. Senate, because it's a huge step down from being governor of Georgia, which is an awesome job, best public housing in the state, your own driver, a lot of power. But the National Republican Senatorial Committee, Washington Republicans are going to camp out on the lawn of the governor's mansion. He's obviously would be the strongest opponent for Jon Ossoff. That would be a battle royale if that ever happened. But, I think Governor Kemp wants to be president of the United States. That's the step up from being governor of Georgia, not being in the U.S. Senate, where you go from being number 1 to being number 100. So I'll end with this. I think that 2026 will be determined in 8 days.
I agree.
If Harris is the president, Republicans are going to have a great year in 2026 in Georgia. If Trump is president, let's hope and pray the Democrats nominate somebody sane for governor.
Wow. Well, Eric, thank you for leading that engaging conversation. There's a microphone on the floor there for questions that people might want to ask our panel. 2 Stephanies racing to the microphone. Stephanie Stuckey first.
Women, yes.
The women vote.
There we go. I need to know what y'all thinking.
Theron knows my politics. I'll try to be nonpartisan.
Brian does too.
Brian knows my politics. All right. Whoever wins, do you think the loser will concede?
I mean, Vice President Harris is a woman that believes in democracy. You look at her track record and how she's governed herself. So I definitely think that you don't have to worry about her. I do worry, Stephanie, about Donald Trump. If he loses, he's pretty much articulated what he would do, and we can't, all forget what happened on January 6th.
I'm supposed to be seeing President Trump in about 3 hours, so I'm going to refrain from answering. Thank you. I don't know. I don't know.
Okay. So, Brian, it's nice to see you again. You mentioned tribalism, and I think we've seen this deepening partisan divide. And I know, respective of what you're both do, professionally, but can you speak to whether or not you feel that the party system is actually beneficial to our country anymore, and what you see long term if we stay just divided on two teams?
Yeah. I tell you, I almost have a hard time talking about this because I get so emotional about it, because this is the greatest country in the world and we're blowing it up. And I think there are a lot of obvious things that we could do. I would love to see us move toward a ranked choice voting system. And, not many rooms where you get applause for that, so thank you. But, I mean, look, I'm somebody who has been a political communicator my entire career. So like, ripping people to shreds has been part of what I've been paid for. I don't pass the 4-way test when I'm doing my job. But I think that we have poisoned the water now. And when I watch MSNBC, which is very rare, they're talking about things I've never heard about. And when my liberal friends watch Fox News, they're talking about things they've never heard about. Like, we're living in completely different universes. How in the world are we ever going to agree? So I would like to see a system where, at the very least, there's an incentive to be nice to the other candidates because you want their voters to make you second on their ballot, right? I think that would be one step in the right direction. But look, there's so many great things about the internet and all of the choices that we have as consumers to get information, but we're all choosing our own information, and increasingly they have no connection to one another.
Doria.
Theron and Brian, it's always a pleasure to hear you talk about politics. It's one of the few conversations where you're going to get something from both sides. In this election, a block of voters that has emerged as important and influential, particularly in Michigan, are Muslim and Arab American voters. And to be honest, I've been confused about both parties in terms of how they've approached them. Theron, you talked about, paying attention to a voter base is important. That has been a challenge, it seems, in some ways from the Democrats. And while the Trump campaign has said they will enact the Muslim ban, Muslim voters are actually getting platformed in rallies there, and he's winning support. So I'm curious about both your perspectives on kind of where that factors the sort of an uncommitted group of Democrats and in general Muslim voters, particularly in Michigan, but obviously in places where, like Georgia, there is a razor-thin margin possible.
Thank you, Doria. This conversation about the rhetoric, but also just what's really going on in the world, particularly in Gaza, and you're talking about the, Trump doubling down now on a full Muslim ban. It's just honestly something we got to have a conversation about. When I talk to a lot of my younger friends, the war in Gaza, even though I'm pro-Israel, I have a lot of Jewish friends, I listen to them because I understand, having been to Israel twice, the challenge there. And I think we all agree is what the Vice President said, that we need to end this war in Gaza, release the hostage, and make sure that we figure out a peaceful way to move forward. And so I definitely think that the leaders are struggling with this, Doria. It's been partisan. It's been so much level of partisanship taken to it, where I think we all just need to figure out what can we do with what we have to have the best outcome. As far as like it being razor thin, I think that you're right. Muslim voters, Asian Pacific Islander voters, Jewish voters, all of these different voters are going to, most of them kind of haven't voted yet, and they're going to pick the candidate, or not vote at all, who they think is going to best help their family and their, sort of commitments move forward. But it's something that, honestly, I thought that by now we would have dealt with it. But I think that even after this election, we're going to have to still have very uncomfortable conversations about race relations and how we continue to try to be allies to different countries in this world.
This is a question for Eric. We understand Pennsylvania may take longer, but when might we know the results of the election? And once we find out, how do we come back together as one country?
That was a question for you, Eric. Bad luck. You thought your job was done.
I thought I was done. I don't know when we'll know the results of Pennsylvania. I don't know if you all have studied the process, but it's probably not going to be the night of the election. It could be days, right? And who knows if there will be challenges. And I guess it depends on what happens the rest of the country, to your second part, because if it all depends on Pennsylvania, then I think, if one candidate wins overwhelmingly in the Electoral College vote, I think that will determine how I think the country reacts to the outcome of the election. If it's really close and it gets down to Pennsylvania, there's going to be one side that's going to be really unhappy, and how they handle it, I think a lot of it's going to be determined by the leader of that ticket. And, depending on who that is, will, I think, determine what happens.
One thing I put in Raffensperger said on Fox News last week that because 70% of the Georgia vote will be in before Election Day, and because those votes have to be counted by 8 p.m., that we actually should have a pretty quick and fast count to this, which would be great, because we know that the longer you wait, the more trust goes down, this belief that there's hijinks going on behind the scenes. But I do want to say to Stephanie's question, and Theron can back me up on this, I have said for 4 years, Joe Biden won the state of Georgia by 11,780 votes. I've never, just for me personally, I just want to say, we need to stop this, right? The count is the count.
So, Chloe, we're going to send Jennifer Dorian up to Pennsylvania, right? And have more Rotary clubs up there do their season of service. David, one final question from you.
Well, first I want to ask Theron what he gets done at the barber, because I'm not really following this. But what I really want to ask is, Theron, you make your living on one side of the political divide, and Brian, you on the other, and you represent that. But if you didn't make your living being a professional Democrat and a professional Republican, what one thing would you actually like to say that you really can't say out loud right now?
Well, first of all, let me answer your barbershop question. So, the barbershop is like the black man's country club, right? And I'm a member of Ansley and In-Town Golf Club. But no, I seriously go there to definitely get a nice shave. My wife is a dermatologist, and so my barber does a really good job of making sure.
I didn't really need an answer there.
But
he fell for it, hook, line, and sinker.
But no, seriously, the question is, what would I be doing if I wasn't doing what I'm doing now, or what would I say?
What would you actually like to say if you didn't worry about, oh man, I'm not going to get another gig?
Rotary membership.
Jennifer's going to fire me from WABE.
Well, Jennifer's held on with me. I've said some things on the podcast. No, look, I live it every day. I don't just do Democratic outreach. When Eric hired me in 2013 at McKenna, Long and Aldridge, they taught me about working across the aisle. He knows this. Speaker Ralston was one of my dear friends. Brian Kemp and I, Marty Kemp, who I'm scared of, we have very, very good conversations. So I think the one thing I would say is really to echo what B-Rob said, and I encourage all of you all to download our podcast. We have very uncomfortable conversations like this, but I just think that honestly more people should speak up when you hear bad things said that are untrue. When Kamala Harris is being called a devil, low IQ, she's antichrist, and so many people sit there and don't push back. And I don't like the name calling when folks say things that may be untrue about Donald Trump too. So I think we just need to listen to each other more and agree to disagree. But there's nothing much, honestly, David, I don't say privately that I don't say publicly. Sometimes I get in trouble for it.
Well, Brian, you just said a couple of minutes ago you weren't going to answer a question because we're going to see Mr. Trump. So, okay, if you didn't have that worry, what would you say?
That was like, well, I just said it. I followed up and said, the vote's voteless. I'll move on for the sake of our country, right? Here's what I would say if I was allowed to without consequences, right? Why in the world do we as Republicans allow trillion-dollar deficits with 4% unemployment? Like, when I hear, when I watch both sides' positive commercials, they're both promising things that I think, dear God, never let this happen, right? The country can't afford it. We're at 30-something plus trillion dollars in debt. And, Kamala's out there accusing Trump of wanting to cut Social Security or raise the retirement age. He ain't going to do that, but God, I would love for him to. For the sake of, if you care about Gen Z, if you care about millennials and those who come after them, by God, we've got to do something. And it's this generation's job to do it. And both parties are failing, and that's what I would say. Thank you, David, for that question. Before we thank the panel, I think, gentlemen, and Eric, thank you for your expert, steady hand and moderation. I hope you both would agree. One call, clear to action for those of us
who do live by the four-way test every day. Don't poison the water. Be nice to the other side. You're going to need them. I hope you both would agree. Brian, thank you so much. I think you've earned the right to come back sooner than 8 years. Theron, I now know what it means when your leg starts to shake and you look at the ceiling. That's sort of metaphor for I'm biting my tongue, right?
Keeping my day job.
Yeah, exactly. Before we thank our panel, just to remind everybody, next week on the eve of the election, we'll have Admiral Blair here to talk about the security challenges of the new administration, to a question that we just had. There'll be no Rotary on November the 11th in observance of Veterans Day. And then on November the 18th, we'll sweeten the deal with a Michelin star panel with a couple of restaurateurs in Atlanta. So we have a lot to look forward to. Peter Hale, where are you? Will you please raise your hand, Peter Hale? Visiting Rotarian from Germany, doing a makeup. So welcome to the club. And thank you to our panel for a wonderful conversation.